courtroom doors swung open, and two people walked in that nobody expected. A young black attorney and a white woman with a press badge still clipped to her jacket. They didn't sit in the gallery. They walked straight to the defense table, where a white man in shackles was about to be sentenced to life. The bailiff leaned toward the prosecutor and whispered, "Who are they?" The answer would shake the entire room, because the truth behind this case wasn't just about a dead man in a warehouse. It was about a secret this town had buried for 22 years. But before we get to that courtroom, before the verdict and the tears and the truth that nearly stayed buried, we need to go back, 22 years back, to a man named Marcus Webb, and the quiet, impossible choice that changed everything. Marcus was 34 the autumn it all began. He worked the overnight line at Ashford Steel Fabrication, a plant on the edge of a small Tennessee town called Ridgemont. It was the kind of job that left a ringing in your ears that never fully went away. He'd been married once, to a woman named Renee, who used to hum off key in the kitchen and could talk her way out of a speeding ticket with nothing but a smile. It died 18 months before this story starts. A car accident on a rain-slicked county road. They'd never had children. The house got quiet after that. Marcus went to work, came home, sat on the back steps, and watched the light fade over a street where everybody waved at him but nobody really stopped to talk anymore. That was the shape of his life on a gray October evening when he pulled into the parking lot of a laundromat on his way home from a double shift. He almost didn't stop. He needed quarters, that was all, and the gas station across the street was out. He saw them before he'd even parked. Two kids sitting on the curb outside the laundromat. A boy and a girl, both white, both shivering in jackets too thin for the weather. The boy looked about 8. The girl maybe 5. Neither one was crying. The boy had his arm looped around his sister's shoulders, holding her the way you hold something you're afraid will be taken from you. Marcus slowed the truck. Something about the stillness of it, the boy not panicking, not performing, just holding on, made him park and walk over. They crouched down. "You two waiting on somebody?" The boy, Caleb, looked up with eyes the color of wet slate, eyes that had already seen more than an 8-year-old should carry. Her aunt said she'd be right back. She dropped us off before school this morning. Marcus looked at the sky. It was already dark. He pieced the rest together over the next hour. Their mother had overdosed 6 weeks earlier. Their father had signed away his rights before the little girl, Maddie, was even born. An aunt had taken emergency custody, but custody was a generous word for what she'd actually been doing, which was disappearing for days at a time and leaving 2 children to fend for each other. Marcus called the sheriff's department. He bought the kids hot cider from the gas station and sat with them on the curb until a cruiser rolled up. 2 deputies stepped out, and their eyes landed on Marcus first, a black man crouched beside 2 small white children in a dark parking lot, before they'd asked a single question. Their hands drifted toward their belts. "Sir, what's your relationship to these kids?" Marcus explained. He explained again. By the 3rd time, he understood, not for the first time in his life, that some people would see the color of his skin before they registered a single word out of his mouth. Before the deputies pulled away, the little girl turned in the back seat and looked at him through the window. One of the deputies asked her if the man had hurt them. Maddie shook her head. "He bought us cider," she said. It was the only sentence she'd spoken all evening. 2 months passed. Marcus went back to his routine. Work, home, silence. But something had shifted in him. He couldn't stop thinking about that boy's arm around his sister. He told himself it wasn't his business, that the state would sort it out. Then he heard through a coworker whose sister worked at the county office that the 2 kids had already cycled through 4 foster placements in 10 weeks. Nobody would take both of them. And Caleb refused to be separated from Maddie. Every time a family tried to split them up, he shut down completely, wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak, until they sent him back. Marcus filed for guardianship on a Wednesday morning before his shift. The reactions came fast. The caseworker, a brisk woman named Diane Foster, looked at him over her reading glasses with an expression trying hard to be neutral. "Mr. Webb, you understand these children are Caucasian. You're aware of that?" "I'm aware." "And you're a single man, living alone, in..." She glanced at the file. "Milltown Road?" "I'm aware of where I live, too." The family court ordered 4 home inspections instead of the standard one. Marcus's own neighbors pulled him aside after church. "Marcus, you're borrowing trouble. A black man raising 2 white kids in this county. That's a target on your back." He heard them. He filed the next round of paperwork anyway. It took 7 months. 7 months of interviews, background checks, and questions dressed up in different clothes but asking the same thing. But on a bright morning in May, a judge signed the order, and Marcus Webb became the legal guardian of Caleb and Maddie. That first night, he'd already set up the spare room. 2 beds, a lamp shaped like a crescent moon, a bookshelf he'd built himself the weekend before. Maddie fell asleep in minutes, the deep, unguarded sleep of a child who finally felt safe enough to let go. Caleb lay rigid under his blanket, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Marcus checked on them before turning in. He stood in the doorway. Caleb's eyes found his in the dark. "Are you gonna leave too?" Marcus didn't answer with words. He pulled the chair from the corner, set it by Caleb's bed, and sat down. He stayed there the whole night. When Caleb woke, Marcus was still in that chair, head tipped back, asleep but present. Something in the boy's eyes shifted. A door that had been bolted shut, cracking open by an inch. The years that followed were never going to be easy. The black single father raising 2 white children in rural Tennessee was a sentence that made people uncomfortable no matter which side of the color line they stood on. The first day of school set the tone. Marcus walked Caleb and Maddie through the front doors of Ridgemont Elementary, holding a hand each. The woman at the front desk smiled at the kids, then looked up at Marcus. "Oh, are you their driver?" "I'm their father," Marcus said. The smile didn't disappear so much as rearrange itself into confusion. The mother near the sign-in table pulled her own daughter half a step closer, like proximity to Marcus's family was something to be shielded from. That afternoon, Caleb sat at the kitchen table without touching his snack. "Dad, why does everybody look at us like that?" Marcus sat down across from him so their eyes were level. "Because they haven't seen this before. That doesn't make it wrong, Caleb. It just makes us first." There were harder moments. When Maddie was 9 and Caleb was 11, Marcus went to a parent-teacher night he'd circled on the calendar 2 weeks early. He wore a clean shirt and brought a folder of both kids' report cards. Straight A's every term, because he'd learned that a black father in a white school always needed receipts. A parent named Karen Whitfield, who sat on the PTA board and whose opinion moved through Ridgemont like weather, stood during open comment. He looked straight at Marcus. "I have to ask, has anyone actually verified this arrangement? A single black man raising 2 white children, and nobody finds that unusual?" The room held its breath. Marcus could have raised his voice. Instead, he stood, opened his folder, and laid the records on the table. "Grades, attendance, counselor notes. This is the only answer I have," he said, "and it's the only one that matters." Nobody said another word, but the moment that cut deepest came when Maddie was 15. Marcus drove to the school to pick her up from track practice, leaning against his truck like always. When she came out with a group of friends, one girl pointed at him and asked who he was. Maddie glanced at her father, then back at her friend and said, "Oh, he's a family friend from church," before hurrying to the car. Caleb heard about it that night from a teammate. He confronted her in the kitchen, voice sharp. "He's our dad, Maddie. How could you say that?" "Don't get it," she snapped, tears already coming. "You're a boy. Nobody whispers about you in the locker room. Nobody asks you every single day why your dad doesn't look like you." Marcus was in the hallway. He heard all of it. He didn't step in. He walked out to the back steps and sat there for hours, watching the dark settle, wondering, for the only time in 22 years, whether his presence in their lives was a weight they'd resent him for eventually. 2 nights later, Maddie found him in the garage, tightening bolts on a lawnmower that didn't need tightening. "I'm sorry, Dad. I was scared, but I was wrong." Marcus set down the wrench. "You're not wrong for being scared, sweetheart. You're only wrong if you let the fear make your choices for you." She hugged him the way she used to when she was 5, back when the whole world was a laundromat curb and a cup of hot cider and a stranger who hadn't walked away. There were good years, too. For Christmas, Caleb was 13, and Maddie was 11. The plant cut hours and money got tight enough that presents weren't happening. Marcus stayed up until 2 a.m., building Maddie a bookshelf from scrap steel shop lumber and repainting Caleb's old bike a blue that almost looked new. Caleb understood immediately what it meant. Not the paint, the hours. And just put his arms around Marcus and held on. Maddie ran to her room and came back with a card drawn in crayon. A small house. 3 figures out front, 1 tall and dark, 2 shorter and light, and underneath, in crooked letters, "Our family." Marcus kept that card in his wallet for the next 16 years. It was still there the night he was arrested. There were smaller, greater victories too. The year Caleb made varsity debate, and Marcus sat in the back row of every meet, keeping score on a folded program because he didn't trust himself to just watch. The summer Maddie decided she wanted to write, and Marcus drove 40 minutes each way, twice a week, so she could take a journalism class at the community college that didn't technically allow high schoolers, until the professor got tired of arguing and just let her stay. He never once told either of them what to become. He only ever showed up to whatever they were already becoming. Caleb went on to graduate from Vanderbilt Law School, top of his class. Marcus sat in the front row in the only suit he owned, the one he'd bought for Renee's funeral and never had another reason to wear. When Caleb spoke at the podium, he said, "I'm standing here because one man taught me that justice isn't something you wait for, it's something you build." Marcus lowered his head and cried in front of other people for the first time since Renee died. Maddie became an investigative reporter at a paper in Nashville. Caleb took a job doing civil litigation in Chattanooga. The kids nobody wanted had become exactly what Marcus always believed they could be. Not because he'd pushed them, but because he'd never once let go. And then the phone call came. It was a Thursday night when everything broke. Gary Holt, the white plant supervisor at Ashford Steel, 49 years old, was found dead in the warehouse loading bay. Blunt force trauma. The county classified it as homicide within hours. Within 2 days, Marcus Webb was in handcuffs. The case against him rested on 3 legs, and every one of them was hollow if anyone bothered to look. First, the plant's keycard log showed Marcus swiped out last on the night Gary died. Second, Marcus and Gary had clashed publicly 3 weeks earlier, after Marcus discovered Gary had been signing off on safety inspections that had never actually happened. Machine guards left off, fire suppression systems logged as tested when they weren't. Marcus had reported it to corporate, a move that made him one very powerful enemy. Third, a night shift guard named Danny Pierce claimed he'd seen Marcus near the loading bay around the time of the murder. That was the whole case. No forensics, no weapon, no footage. A badge swipe, an argument, and one man's word. Marcus told the investigators the truth. He'd swiped out, gotten to his truck, remembered he'd left his thermos inside, and gone back for it. He never went near the loading bay. He never saw Gary. But the truth in Ridgemont had a way of bending around a black man the way light bends around a black hole, close enough to touch, never quite reaching him. The public defender came to see him once. "They're pushing first degree, life without parole. My honest advice, plead to voluntary manslaughter. You're looking at 15 years instead of life." "I didn't kill anyone." "I understand that, Mr. Webb. But this jury pool is what it is." Marcus leaned forward. "I've spent 22 years teaching my children that the truth matters, that you don't lie, and you don't let fear make your choices. I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do. Not for 15 years. Not for 15 minutes. The public defender withdrew 2 days before trial, citing a scheduling conflict. Esther Reyes from Marcus's church called Maddie's newsroom in Nashville. "I'm sorry to be the one telling you this. Her dad's been arrested. They're saying he killed a man at the plant." Maddie was in the middle of the biggest story of her career. She left it on her desk and was on the highway within the hour. Caleb got the call that same evening, mid-preparation for a case he'd spent 6 months building. He pulled the court filings on his father's case, and the lawyer in him saw immediately what the son in him already knew. The entire thing rested on circumstantial evidence and a single eyewitness. He called Maddie. "This case has holes you could drive a truck through. Somebody wanted Dad to take the fall." "I know," she said. "I'm already driving." Caleb understood the risk of representing his own father. The prosecution would call him biased, compromised. But he also understood that no lawyer in Ridgemont was going to fight with everything they had for a black man accused of killing a white supervisor in a town where the Ashford name was on half the buildings. If Marcus was going to get a real defense, it would come from the people who actually knew what kind of man he was. They met at a gas station halfway between Nashville and Ridgemont. 2 grown adults who'd once been 2 cold children on a laundromat curb, and made their decision without needing many words. They were going back. The trial of Marcus Webb began on a Monday morning in the Ridgemont County Courthouse, and from the first hour, the room felt like a verdict waiting to happen. Caleb took his seat beside his father at the defense table. He'd filed the proper motions, been approved as counsel, but that didn't stop the whispers when the jury saw a young black attorney place a hand on the shoulder of the white man beside him. The gesture was brief, instinctive. In that courtroom, it carried a second meaning the prosecution was more than ready to use. The lead prosecutor was Vance Calloway, a district attorney with a conviction rate the local paper loved to print. He wasn't theatrical. He was precise. The kind of prosecutor who could make circumstantial evidence sound like scripture just by choosing the right words in the right order. Jury selection told Caleb everything he needed to know. 11 white jurors, 1 black juror, to challenge the composition. Judge Alan Prout, a soft-spoken jurist who'd sat that bench for 18 years, denied it without much comment. Caleb noted it for the record and moved on. Calloway's opening never once said the word race. He didn't need to. He talked about the argument over the safety logs. He talked about opportunity, a man alone in a plant at night. He talked about motive, a worker who thought his supervisor was cutting corners. Every sentence painted the same portrait this country has been painting for centuries. Caleb's opening went the opposite direction. No performance, just a question. Where is the physical evidence? He looked at each juror in turn. The prosecution wants you to believe my client committed murder. But where's the proof? Not the assumptions. The proof. Badge swipe that shows a man went to work. An argument from 3 weeks ago. And one witness I'm going to ask you to examine very carefully. That's not a case. That's a story with the blanks filled in. And in America, we don't convict people on stories. The prosecution's key witness took the stand on day 2. Danny Pierce, the night guard, had the stiff posture of a man who'd rehearsed. He testified that at roughly 10:40 that night, he'd seen Marcus Webb walking toward the loading bay. Recognized him by his build. Was certain. Caleb stood for cross-examination with a single printed floor plan of the plant. Mr. Pierce, where exactly were you standing when you say you saw my client? Front gate booth. Caleb held up the map. The front gate is here. The loading bay is here, nearly 250 yards away, on the far side of 2 production buildings. There's no direct line of sight between those points. He turned. They're telling this court you identified a specific person from 250 yards at night, through 2 buildings? Pierce's confidence cracked. I know his walk. I've worked with him for years. Caleb repeated it slowly. His walk. That's from 250 yards. He let it sit. Mr. Pierce, isn't it true that 1 week after Gary Holt's death, you were promoted to head of night security? That was routine. Who signed the promotion order? Pierce glanced at the prosecution table before answering. Trevor Ashford, VP of Operations. Trevor Ashford, Caleb repeated. The owner's son. The same Trevor Ashford who oversees all personnel decisions at this plant. Who sat down. No further questions. The seed was planted. While Caleb fought inside the courtroom, Maddie worked outside it. He'd taken leave from the paper, though leave was generous for what amounted to walking off a career-defining story mid-draft. He started with the money, pulled public financial filings for Ashford Steel, cross-referenced them against maintenance and safety certification logs, and began quietly interviewing current and former employees willing to talk. What she found was bigger than one dead man. Gary Holt hadn't just been skipping inspections, working with Trevor Ashford. He'd been falsifying safety compliance paperwork for at least 4 years, pocketing the difference between what real inspections and repairs would have cost and what the company claimed to spend, while machine guards stayed broken and fire systems went untested. The team had been bleeding the company for years while workers ran equipment that was one bad shift away from killing somebody. Marcus had stumbled onto the edge of it without knowing the scope. As line supervisor, he'd seen equipment logged as inspected and passed that was visibly, obviously not. He'd reported it to Gary first. Gary brushed him off. So Marcus went over Gary's head, straight to corporate, which meant his complaint landed on the desk of Trevor Ashford, the man profiting from the fraud. 3 weeks before Gary died, Marcus had gone further still. He'd filed a formal request with the Tennessee Occupational Safety Division for a surprise inspection. If that inspection had gone through, the entire scheme would have unraveled, and both Gary and Trevor would have faced criminal charges. Maddie called Caleb from her motel room at midnight. This wasn't random. Gary and Trevor Ashford were falsifying safety records for years. Dad found out and reported it. 3 weeks before Gary died, Dad filed for a state inspection. If that inspection happened, Trevor was finished. Caleb was quiet, processing. Someone needed the fraud trail shut down before the inspectors showed up, Maddie said. And they needed someone the town would already believe was guilty. Dad was perfect, Caleb finished. The argument on record. Badge swipe. And he's black in a county where that's still the most damning evidence of all. Trevor Ashford hadn't gotten where he was by being careless. Within days of Maddie's questions circulating, the pressure started. 2 employees who'd agreed to talk went silent overnight. One called from a blocked number, whispering, "I've got a family. I can't be part of this," before the line went dead. Then Maddie's editor called, his voice careful in a way that told her someone with influence had already made a phone call. You're on personal leave. If you're using your press credentials to interfere with an active criminal case, we're going to have to talk about your employment. Inside the courtroom, Calloway shifted tactics, attacking not the evidence, but the defense's credibility. During a motion hearing, he told the room, "The defense attorney is the adopted son of the defendant. Every argument he makes is colored by attachment, not fact. Weigh his words accordingly." Caleb chose his response carefully. "The prosecution suggests my relationship with my client compromises my judgment. I'd suggest the opposite. I know this man's character. And more importantly, I know the evidence, or rather, the lack of it." But he could feel the ground shifting, and he wasn't sure which direction. The weight landed heaviest on Marcus. In the county jail, stripped of routine, he began folding inward, barely eating, barely speaking. During a visit, separated by plexiglass, Caleb saw something in his father's eyes he'd never seen before. Not fear, quiet exhaustion that looked like surrender. "I want you and Maddie to stop," Marcus said. "I don't want you two burning down your careers for this." Caleb pressed his hand flat against the glass. "You didn't quit when the whole town said you had no business raising us. You didn't quit after Karen Whitfield humiliated you at that school meeting. You didn't quit after Maddie called you a family friend, and you sat outside all night and still showed up the next morning. So don't ask me to quit now." Marcus raised his hand to the same spot on the glass, an inch of plastic in 22 years between their palms. That night, in the motel parking lot, Maddie and Caleb had the hardest argument of their lives. Maddie wanted to publish immediately. The fraud, the falsified records, the timeline connecting Trevor Ashford to a cover-up. "If I run this tonight, every outlet in the state picks it up by morning. The judge can't ignore it. If you publish before I present it in court," Caleb said, "Calloway moves for a mistrial. He argues the jury's tainted. The judge grants it, and Dad sits in that cell for another year waiting on a retrial. He won't survive that. And if you try to present it and the judge shuts you down, at least the public knows. I'm his lawyer, Maddie. I need you to trust me." Maddie stared at the cracked asphalt for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. "I do trust you, but I also remember sitting in that hallway, hearing him out on the steps alone for hours because I was too ashamed to call him my dad. I will not let anyone make him sit alone again." They agreed. Caleb would file to introduce the new evidence. If the judge allowed it, they'd fight inside the system. If he rejected it, Maddie would publish within the hour. Caleb filed the motion the next morning. The fraud, the falsified inspections, Marcus's request to the state, the suspicious timing of Pierce's promotion. Judge Pruitt read it in chambers for nearly an hour before returning to the bench. "The defense's motion to introduce supplementary evidence is denied," he said. "These materials relate to corporate compliance matters outside the scope of a murder trial. They do not meet the standard for exculpatory evidence." Caleb felt it land like a physical weight. The judge wasn't entirely wrong on the technicality. But without the fraud evidence, all he had left was the thinness of the prosecution's case. And in a room where the defendant was black and the victim was white, thinness wasn't always enough. Calloway's closing that afternoon spoke about duty and accountability without ever raising his voice. It didn't need to. Every sentence landed in the gap between evidence and fear. The gap where prejudice lives and convictions are born. The jury deliberated 4 hours and came back deadlocked. Judge Pruitt sent them back for the morning, warning that a continued impasse meant a mistrial. And a mistrial meant Marcus stayed in a cell while the whole process started over. That night, back in his cell, Marcus reached into his wallet and pulled out a piece of paper, soft and creased from 16 years of folding and unfolding. A crayon drawing of a small house, 3 figures out front, 1 tall and dark, 2 shorter and light, and 2 crooked words underneath. Our family. He pressed it against his chest and closed his eyes. Somewhere across town, Maddie wasn't sleeping either. The legal road had narrowed to a point. But she was the daughter of a man who'd taught her, by example, that you don't wait for someone else to do the right thing. She scrolled to a name she'd found buried in an old Ashford Steel personnel file 3 days earlier and hadn't known what to do with. Ruth Callahan, former HR administrator, 18 years at the company, quietly pushed into early retirement 2 months after Gary Holt's death. Maddie drove to Ruth's house at 11 that night. A small place at the edge of town, porch light off, curtains drawn. Everything about it said go away. She knocked anyway. "Mrs. Callahan, my name's Maddie Webb. I know you worked at Ashford Steel 18 years, and I know you were pushed out right after Gary Holt died. I'm not here as a reporter. I'm here as a daughter. My father's in a cell tonight for something he didn't do, and I think you might know something that could help him." The deadbolt turned. Ruth Callahan studied Maddie's face for a long moment, then stepped aside and let her in. What she told her changed everything. On the night Gary died, Ruth had gone back to the plant after hours to collect personal files before her forced retirement took effect. Walking the back corridor near the loading bay, she'd seen Trevor Ashford coming from that direction, clothes disheveled, hands shaking. When he saw her, he froze. "You were never here tonight," he told her. Not a request, a command. 2 days later, Ruth got her early retirement notice. Her pension, administered under a plan Trevor controlled, was the leash. Keep quiet, keep the pension. Talk, lose everything. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Maddie asked. Ruth looked at her folded hands. "Because in this town, when the Ashfords tell you to be quiet, you're quiet. That's how it's always worked. It doesn't have to work that way tomorrow." Ruth looked at this young woman who'd driven across the state and knocked on a stranger's door at 11 at night to save a father who didn't look a thing like her, and understood something she'd been avoiding for months. Silence wasn't safety. It was complicity. She agreed to testify. The next morning, Caleb filed an emergency motion to call a new witness before deliberations resumed. Calloway was on his feet immediately, objecting that it was a stalling tactic and procedurally improper. Caleb cited Brady v. Maryland, the prosecution's obligation to disclose evidence favorable to the defense, and argued that blocking an eyewitness with direct knowledge of another suspect's movements the night of the murder would be a constitutional violation ripe for reversal on appeal. Judge Pruitt weighed his instinct to control his courtroom against his awareness that an appellate court wouldn't be kind to a judge who'd suppressed exculpatory eyewitness testimony in a murder trial. "The motion is granted," he said. "The witness will be heard." Ruth Callahan took the stand in a courtroom so quiet her own footsteps echoed. She wasn't dramatic. She didn't cry. She described Trevor Ashford emerging from the loading bay corridor, disheveled, shaking, and repeated his exact words. "You were never here tonight." She explained without excuses why she'd stayed silent. The pension, the pressure, the unspoken rules of a town run by one family. Calloway cross-examined her hard. "Why should this jury believe a story you sat on for months? Isn't it possible this is resentment toward a company that let you go?" Ruth turned to face the jury directly. "I stayed quiet because I was scared. That's what people do in this town when the Ashfords say be quiet. I'm not proud of it, but I'm here now because I watched an innocent man get charged with murder, and my silence was helping it happen." When Calloway sat down, something in the room had shifted. Quietly, the way pressure changes before a storm breaks, Caleb rose for his closing. No performance. Just the plain, direct way his father had always spoken. "My father, Marcus Webb, spent 22 years raising 2 children the world said weren't his to raise. He never asked what he'd get in return. And when he found out his workplace was falsifying safety records that could get someone killed, he didn't stay quiet. He reported it. Because that's who he is. A man who does the right thing even when it costs him. That cost is why he's sitting here today. Not because of evidence. Because he was convenient. Because a powerful man needed someone to blame, and a black man in a county that's never figured out what to do with black men who don't stay in their lane was the easiest target available. You've heard a badge swipe that proves my client went to work. You've heard a witness whose story can't survive basic geometry, and now you've heard from a woman who saw, with her own eyes, another man leaving that scene. A man with motive, opportunity, and the power to keep everyone around him silent. Justice isn't something you wait for. It's something you build. Today you're the builders." Caleb sat down beside his father. Marcus looked at him, not with hope, not with fear, but the way you look at something you built standing on its own for the first time. The jury deliberated 51 minutes. The foreperson stood and unfolded a single sheet of paper. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we the jury find the defendant not guilty." Marcus didn't move, eyes closed, hands flat on the table. Caleb put a hand on his shoulder. The same gesture from day one. And this time, neither of them let go. Maddie came from the gallery and wrapped her arms around both of them, and for a long moment the 3 of them held on in the middle of a courtroom that had tried to tear them apart. Marcus opened his eyes, looked at his children, both crying, both stronger than he'd ever given himself credit for building, and said the only thing that came to him. "You two grew up on me." Maddie laughed through her tears, and the sound filled the courtroom the way Renee's used to fill a kitchen. In the weeks that followed, Maddie's investigation ran. Federal investigators opened a case against Trevor Ashford. Fraud, obstruction, conspiracy. Annie Pierce pled guilty to perjury for a reduced sentence. Marcus went home. The little house on Milltown Road was older now. The paint a little more tired, but the family photo still hung in the hallway where it always had. Maddie took the crayon card, our family, sealed it in a clear case, and set it on the bookshelf Marcus had built her out of scrap steel shop lumber on a Christmas when money was tight and love was the only currency it had. That evening, Marcus sat on the back steps and watched the light go down the way he had 1,000 times before. Maddie sat beside him. Caleb leaned against the rail. Nobody spoke for a while. Some things don't need words. They just need somebody there. When Marcus finally broke the silence, he said something neither of them expected. People always ask me why I took you two in. Never had a good answer. Think I finally do. He looked at them both. I needed you a lot more than you ever needed me. Maddie shook her head, smiling. Dad, that might be the most ridiculous and truest thing you've ever said. 22 years earlier, a man had chosen to love two children the world said weren't his. He hadn't asked for anything back. He'd simply shown up every single day and built something everyone told him couldn't last. A family that didn't match, in a town that never approved, held together by nothing but the stubborn conviction that love doesn't need permission, and justice doesn't wait for an invitation. And in the end, the thing he'd built was the only thing strong enough to save him. Not the law, not the system. His children, the ones nobody wanted, the ones he chose. They saved him the same way he'd saved them. Not with grand gestures, with the simple, ferocious refusal to let go. Maybe that's the thing worth remembering. Not the courtroom, not the verdict. Somewhere out there right now, someone is deciding to love a person the world says isn't theirs to love. And that quiet, unremarkable choice might be the one thing that saves them both, 22 years from now. If this one got you, tell me. Who's your Marcus? Drop it in the comments. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe.